Hello and welcome to another episode of the SEO Unplugged podcast. I'm your host, Itamar Blauer. Today I'm joined with Natalia Witczyk, who's an international SEO consultant. Natalia, how's it going?
It's a very beautiful morning here in Barcelona, and thank you for having me. Very happy to be here.
All right, we're starting off with a flex already. Very good. Thank you, Natalia. Good to hear. All right, so in this episode, we're going to be talking about website migrations. It's something that I know a lot of people in the SEO industry, especially, get a bit scared when they come across website migrations. It sounds like a monster, a big bad thing that's out to get you, and where lots of things can go wrong, which I mean, in reality, they can. But we're going to be talking through today a bunch of that stuff. So, I suppose, first and foremost, let's say whether you're a consultant or somebody working in an agency or even in house, and a client or somebody goes up to you and says, we're going to be migrating the site. We're going to be changing platform, whether we're changing domain or we're just sort of going to re-platform. So when you hear that, first and foremost, what do you do? Like, how do you estimate that type of project? How do you go about planning? What do you say to them in terms of where I suppose SEO sort of fits in, and what is your approach with that?
Yeah, that's a very good starting question because I think we really have to start with explaining that it's such a different experience to be an SEO in a web dev agency and be exposed to that from the inside and be in the one team that tries to make the migration happen together. And there's such a different experience when you're an external SEO plugged into a project just to be there for SEO, but you are not really familiar with the team and you don't really have a say because there is no reason why they should give you that much credit if they don't know you, right? So I was quite lucky early in my career to be exposed to agencies that had web dev teams. Actually, they were more known for web dev than SEO. So when you are part of the team, I can tell you a lot about that. And when you are on the other side, I can try to tell you something about it because I'm recently experiencing that side. So I'd say definitely the first step is making sure that SEO service is being sold as part of the migration. And it's not something that the client expects without having allocated the budget and the expectation on. So through error and lesson, I found that estimating a percentage of migration budget for SEO part or the whole web dev project. And so like between 5 and 10% of the whole allocation of the whole budget typically works best because there's no minimum hours you have to do or minimum tasks. It always depends on the size of the project. So if we say it's a 100K website development, bespoke service, you really need with 5% of that. If it's a tiny, change or maybe just template change, but not a CMS change, something like that, and 5% of a smaller budget is also okay because there will be less risk and less surprises there for SEO. So that's how I ended up working on a percentage of entire web dev budget.
Okay, so when you take that, then what do you kind of say in terms of, let's say we're taking a website and the scenario is that they're going to re-platform. So they're going to move from one CMS to another. The domain's going to stay the same. Let's put it that way. The domain's going to stay the same, but depending on the platform you change, there might be changes in the URL structures, for example. So let's say you're working with that and the site has maybe 100,000 URLs to it. What would you do then in terms of like, what would you say to the client in terms of like when you estimate the project length and stuff like that? What is it like? What should the approach be, and how do you get them to also understand what they need to do? Because they might say to you, we're migrating the site, but then in your mind, you're like, the alarms start going off, and it's like, okay, they're going to need to consider a lot of different things. So how do you actually approach those conversations in the beginning?
So the perfect approach is to be as involved from the very beginning as possible and just be part of the development and design conversation and be there listening in, not maybe every single meeting, but it's crucial in the beginning to later plan when your involvement is necessary, basically. So what I used to be involved in is the very beginning of the project, listening in and raising my hand all the time, and the meeting raising hand thing, and being like, hey, SEO will be needed here. Please, let me know when that thing happens, and I'm gonna jump in and review this and review that. And it's kind of always different. There's no one checklist. I mean, there can be one huge checklist of literally everything, but I don't usually work off those because every project is so different. I'd rather sit down and actually see when my help is essential. And it's about educating developers and the client when SEO can actually play a big role. So it's listening in, being there, and raising the hand when needed. And then typically it's some SEO involvement on every stage of the process, but the very beginning decision making of URLs, what's being migrated. That's typically when you say, oh, I can prepare a list of URLs by traffic in Search Console and in analytics. Would you like that? Would that help in your internal decision making? And the clients would go like, oh yeah, we could actually do with that instead of just making decisions out of our sensation, what our users like. So very much about putting yourself forward in those moments. So that's the starting point. Essentially, the question was, what's the starting point? How do I start? Analytics, Search Console, impressions, not even clicks sometimes, impressions. Whatever gets impressions must be already meeting some search intent. Whatever is not even indexed, we can just cut. If there is no other use than SEO for it, of course, because there's always more to play. But you always tell your clients you're representing the SEO side of things, the argument, and then there's the negotiation starting, and then all other ideas come in.
Yeah, 100%. And I suppose with that, so that's a really good point in terms of URLs that currently get impressions and actually knowing like that there is a use case for them. What would you go, or how would you go about other types of URLs? Because, for example, when I've dealt with certain migration projects, the sort of let's say I was dealing with a dev agency, and they said, yeah, so as part of our process, we're going to basically just have a crawl of the site and do that. And I'm like, okay, are you taking just the internal HTML URLs, or are you also taking into account other things like the media assets and images and stuff like that? So how would you go about that? Because obviously with maybe those types of URLs, Google Search Console might not give you really much about that. So how would you approach prioritizing that, and sort of what's the high impact stuff that should always be a focus?
In a very ideal scenario, which hardly ever exists, you get enough time before the migration happens to maybe impact the content and consolidate it before you actually migrate. So you already make changes on your side. So, and that being said, what I'm actually about to say is something more interesting. So I find a lot of old style websites with a lot of PDFs that are ranking really well. I'm personally not a fan of PDFs as a search asset to promote. I don't usually recommend migrating PDFs as they are. I'd rather move them to be pages. I know there is a debate around it, and I don't say it's the SEO truth. And I know arguments when people say, let the PDF stay, they rank, they're doing fine, this is what users are used to. But if it's my personal opinion in this, I would say identify all the PDFs that are really doing well and make sure you have a page that englobes that. Then you can link to a non-indexable PDF if that's still needed, but typically it's just because there's no page that reflects the same content. And typically also pages you move from PDF to being actual page without losing the value they provide, sometimes maybe adding some extra, they can do as well as the PDF beforehand. So I would say if you have the prep time, you get some assets that you can transform to pages, and that could work. Image is an interesting one. I would definitely say that it really depends how image search dependent the website is. I do have some B2B clients that don't really get image traffic, so I don't really need to pay that much attention there. Probably the assets that are the most important ones is the company identity. So if anyone Googles the logo, that they actually find the logo, because so many rebrandings happened in the past and the actual logo of things is not even found anywhere. So maybe those things, yes, I will probably pay attention to that. And then the basics. And then if it's obviously an e-commerce that is super product image heavy, then image migration is a whole new story. And if platform is the same, that's easy. And if we are changing the platform, typically the URLs have to change.
Yeah, for sure. And I suppose that's where it's like giving the concrete answers with this is always quite tricky, because every migration is going to be different. And it's more, I suppose, about how you prioritize what the business needs and what the business relies on not only for it to get traffic, but also, how people assess the brand, as you said, how, the business actually makes money. So if it is e-com focused, your priorities might be slightly different as opposed to if it was a B2B service provider, for example. But this sort of leads on to something that I wanted to get your opinion on in terms of how you deal with old or legacy URLs within migrations, in terms of, what should you redirect to where? What would you leave the same? Because a lot of people, especially if we're sort of talking about when you've got, even if we put migrations aside, but even other domains, say you bought a domain, lots of people like 301 the domain just as a whole to the new domain. So, like, how would you approach this with migrations in terms of how you approach the redirects that you put in place?
Yeah, there's some websites I've worked on that kind of migrates in some way every 3 years or so. So there's so much legacy URLs lost there, either in Search Console or still getting external links. And until very recently, I was very, very specific about every single URL I could find and trying to redirect it. And then, yeah, like probably 3 years ago in my career, the biggest migrations of all happened. And it was migrating to Sitecore. So you can imagine that was quite a huge enterprise project. And that's the hard way I learned that some servers have got limits in the lines you can have in your htaccess or config file, web config file. In this case, it was .NET technology. So the limit was approached within 10% of my redirect plan. And we had to pivot very quickly. So I don't remember the exact number of the lines you can have in the file, but it didn't even occur in my mind that this is going to be so limiting. So definitely that changed my perspective. And again, this will depend on the size of the project. If you have a small WordPress size website, 200 pages, you probably can redirect all legacy URLs that ever existed and still be fine, and there will be no issues with the server. And then you get an enterprise client and you have to cut off and say, we're just doing this many URLs or this many patterns. So what I find now is ChatGPT and other AI-like elements are so great in finding those patterns in huge lists of redirect plans. So as much as you can merge and make one rule out of hundreds or tens of URLs, this is going to save you so much space. So I would say, first, prioritize some way. Maybe don't use 10-year-old migrated 3 times ago URLs anymore, because I don't think there is much value in it. I even heard someone say recently that probably the 301s from legacy links take up to a year, giving some value, and then they just don't. I don't know if we can put a strict timeline on this, but if it's 10 years old, I would be very, very convinced to say it probably doesn't bring you any value anymore to redirect that. So just leave it be, or even remove those old redirects completely. Unless they have really good links, and maybe think about it. And yeah, prioritize by the website size and make as many, rules that are wildcards instead of just one-to-one.
Yeah, and you touched upon something quite interesting there about using AI to at least help you with that process in terms of speeding things up. So what have you sort of found with that, the main use cases or the most helpful ways that you've been able to incorporate AI within the sort of website migration projects that you've done?
So essentially, the one simple for AI task and difficult for human beings is just looking for those patterns in the URLs. So I would maybe have a manual redirect one, or just the old versus new URLs and just connecting the dots. It really depends on what solution you can afford, because probably just ChatGPT, the simple one, doesn't do the job the same way as OpenAI API. So definitely, it really depends on your resources on this. And in the last case I had the lack of developers having access to OpenAI GPT API. So essentially, I told them, look, we need to take this and synthesize it, and they just did the magic within minutes, I believe. I do not have that paid version yet. I might invest soon. And essentially, I typically prioritize by some kind of metric. So it's typically, in my case, impressions. No impressions, not really having any traffic, not relevant page. Is it worth redirecting? I don't know. If you have to make decisions like that. If you don't, you redirect everything. But if you have to be let's say, more prudent about what you redirect, then some criteria of a sort is already a good criteria. I don't know what you think, actually, because there's so many approaches in this. Would you rather redirect more or less?
I mean, well, it depends what it is. If I could, I'd do more, but it would be sort of more specific. So if I'm using maybe AI just to help with to speed things up in a way, then that would be great. But in terms of like, redirect mapping, if I can find an easier way to find very specific paths or types of pages and sort of do that in a more efficient way, then absolutely I would do more as opposed to less. But I suppose then we've covered the sort of planning and the initial stages, so pre-migration stuff quite comprehensively already. How would you approach in terms of what you prioritize, when the migration is actually happening, in terms of, let's say you've got staging access and sort of checking through that sort of stuff. And then also once the migration is done, in terms of how do you sort of plan, or at least assuming you've got benchmarks, what are the sort of things that you look for and how long do things take with that? So let's start maybe with the staging access, and say the migration's going through and you're working with a dev team and they've got that going there. What are some of the main things that you would do at that point?
Well, there's always the classic thing of checking that everything that was supposed to be coded there is there. Well, I mean, I'm still checking that the staging side, and then there is internal linking as it should be, because I often find this is the two things that could be most overlooked by the developers, maybe because they don't see the value in it. Also, I mean, ideally you'll have a relative internal linking everywhere in the access part, so you can easily see if everything is linked to as it should be. So the day of the migration, internal linking stays the same, as correct as it was, and there is no staging side links. I always check this if staging side is being blocked correctly and if it's been blocked on time. So one thing is blocking it by robots, which many developers I work with already do, which is great, but many do it too late. So it's the staging version has been indexed, and that's when the robots have to disappear, and you have to no index it with either the server side response or meta robots. So there's always some mix up with that. So I feel like developers have educated enough to know something, but it's still not the need process. So yeah, so I check that. So when we launch the new version of the site, there's no duplication of sort. And probably verifying the image optimization, because no one has tested it yet. They didn't have it in mind when they were building it. So if there is no ridiculous size images, because it's easily replaceable on the staging version, just like that, I believe, before it launches. And if it's already launched, it will be harder to prioritize that task. Maybe that will be the top 3. But essentially, I'm doing a very quick audit. I use the Screaming Frog. I review everything. I check response codes. I check if 404 is a 404. I check if 301 is a 301 and not a 302. All those basics that you might think about, developer could confuse. This is the time to make sure. Yeah, the 404 one is actually a funny one. I feel like the whole generation of new developers have forgotten why 404 is called the 404. So I still see those pages that are 404 error page responding with a 200 error, or a 302 going to a URL that is a 404. And I'm thinking, what do you think 404 means? Like, why would we use that word, So all those like small bits, the staging site should be tested for. And yeah, probably, yeah, that's my answer.
You were going to open up a can of worms there. I think like my approach to that stuff, and it also what you are doing there is, when that migration is happening, is you're doing your due diligence. And I think like the last thing that I want is to put all of my faith and trust, not that I don't want to, but it's more just like I don't want it to get to the point that if it's something that I could have stepped in to like make sure was working fine, then it's not on me if something does go wrong. So it's like I will bluntly say, I'll be like, hey, dev team, can we make sure that we no index this entire staging environment? Or even if it sounds like a bit silly, even if they might be like, yeah, we were going to be on that, I'd rather get that sort of, them to reaffirm that, as opposed to me not saying something and then having to go in and later and be like, oh, this staging site is indexed, and we gotta clean some stuff up here. And then because then that is just more work for you. It's a lot more hassle, and then that's also not great for like the relationships within the teams to suddenly have to be like, "Hey, dev person, you forgot to no index this whole site on staging." So yeah, doing your due diligence is important for sure. And I guess then when it comes to, let's assume everything's gone right, you're happy with everything when you've sort of gone through the checks and your crawls with that staging environment, let's say everything's fine, and then the migration happens. So post migration, then what would be the sort of main things that you look out for to at least determine whether or not it has worked in terms of maybe what you were expecting before? Like, what would your approach be with that?
Definitely, you need to allow Google bots some time to make sense of the new site. Definitely, you will want to, push Google to see it as soon as you know everything is fine. So you will, I'd still do it. I manually request the indexing. It's questionable how quick it's actually making it happen, but it's such a small step. I just feel like I'm on top of it. I'm just doing it for the sake of it. And I found something really interesting recently. I've spoken with a few really smart SEOs about it, and they had this theory that I start to lean towards as well. It somewhat feels like the faster the migration took to be reflected and the traffic has recovered, typically it's correlated with the fact that website had a smaller backlink profile. It almost feels like if you have a huge backlink profile that you depend on mostly for this huge visibility you have, Google will need to recrawl the external links and reflect them onto you. So the bigger brand, the bigger site, the older, more legacy content that actually has been accumulated over years, more global, it might take slower to fully kick in. So there's this mythical 2 weeks to up to 1 month that people have been repeating over and over. And I think that's the case for many websites. Small, not really backlink dependent sites that rank due to other reasons might really recover super quickly. I had a WordPress site from a local surgeon in Barcelona migrated after one day being the same level as they were before the migration, and then even going up slowly. So it can be anything. And I think it really, the size of the website and the backlink profile are the two main elements, the backlink profile being the more important one. So I definitely manage those expectations based on that with the client.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting point. And I suppose in that case, you would maybe in the early stages, and when they ask you, sort of like, okay, when can we expect, like, what should we expect to happen? Obviously, if you say, well, if it all goes to plan, you shouldn't really lose traffic, for a lengthy period of time. But if you actually, yeah, take a look at things like the backlink profile of a site, then you could actually say to them, it's like, hey, look, because of the history of the site, because of the perceived strength and authority the domain has, you might actually find that it might take a bit longer because Google may have to recrawl all of those, yeah, like you say, the external links pointing to the domain, seeing where those URLs are now going, and yeah, that process will take more time, which is really interesting. And I suppose on the point of traffic dips and stuff like that, if you could tell me what I want to know the biggest migration horror story that you've come across. Give me the biggest one, and I'll just sit back.
I have two amazing stories. One is a very old one from the beginning of my career. One is the fresh one. Which should I go with first?
You pick. Go for it.
Maybe the fresh one because it's the closer to my memory and more surprising one, I guess. So I have this client I signed on as an independent consultant literally a year ago. And they did migrate 8 years ago and never recovered the traffic, but never really did SEO because they still have got a lot of traffic. And it's a public organization, so they're not so money and conversion driven as one would hope, I guess. But now they started to think that way finally. And it takes me a couple of weeks to dig in, make a huge technical audit. It's million URL website, so I'm not even crawling everything. I'm just going with basics and languages that they prioritized. And it turns out they've never migrated. They've launched the new website in a new folder, which is web version 3, and the web version 2 was still there, and it always worked. And it's the old branding, old design. So they didn't really drop, they just didn't shift the content. And they were convinced they have migrated. They did not grasp how I found this on the internet. And it was in top 20 ranking pages, one of the old pages. So it's been 8 years, right? Old content has been pushed away. It wasn't that good either. So obviously the newer version, linked to more often, got more traction, but the old site still performed. And I would say, like, make sure you migrate, and it might happen more often than you think, especially if maybe there was an M subdomain that maybe wasn't migrated. There's so many things that I feel like with the new generation of CMSs and approaches towards servers, we don't even imagine what could be happening in the backend before all that modern technology happened. It could be dead bodies in the closets all the time. But that's, I think, my top horror story. Like, no migration, basically. And the second one is I guess more impactful in my career, because that's the first time I had a migration happen when I was in an agency that the client didn't tell us about. They told us on the day. And I hear people say that happens, and other people be like, how? And I'm like, yeah, I actually don't believe how, but it happened to me very early on. So I actually understand it happens. And it was a very funny one because it's a huge Fortune 500 corporate from Europe. I can't say the name because I don't think they will be listening, but who knows? And they had a new CMO join, and they had this plan to rejuvenate the company. So they decided to migrate from www to a subdomain that was Go to make it sound young and fresh. So they migrated everything from www to Go. And they didn't tell us about it. So part of the migration was done by them, but not fully. They forgot about some weird mini sites that were built on different CMS that was not reflected in the migration plan. And they really dropped, and they didn't recover it until a year later. They were recovering a bit. They still had loads of traffic. So it was also shocking how badly you can perform and still get around with it. Obviously, there was impact on traffic that was negative, but surprisingly less than I would have expected. And then for months, we were recovering new mini sites and new landing pages and new backlinks that should have been redirected, and doing all this work for the CMO to change their mind and the organization come back to the www. But the shocking bit is that when they came back to www, they basically recovered. And this is the sad truth about SEO. It really depends who you work for, because Fortune 500 recognized brands with traffic that belongs to them, with core products that people search for instead of general discovery, will really get away with so much more. So that's such a different piece of work. Obviously, there's also bigger gains that you can have. So as an SEO, you can make more impact, but essentially, it's not that the company is going to disappear overnight and really have big trouble, even if they make such a horrific mistake like this one.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that I was trying to think of how I'd name them. I think, yeah, the first one being a no migration just sounds it just sounds funny. And the second one to me strikes as more of I don't know what you would call it, like a Gen Z migration. They just wanted to sound cool, down with the kids. They just,
but also not done by Gen Z. It was someone who wanted to be Gen Z, but didn't,
The wannabe Gen Z migration. That's yeah, very good. But actually, it's a fair point that you say with that one, because you can get away with certain stuff if you've got the brand strength behind you, where people are actively searching for you. And I guess that is different as opposed to if it's a lot of non-branded traffic dependent websites and businesses. So I mean, fair play. I would have conversation. I want to know who the wannabe Gen Z is and just ask them why they thought that was a good idea. But that's another story. But yeah, two very, very good examples, Natalia. And I think on that note, because I will ask you some more questions after about that. But where can people find you if they want to learn more or ask you some questions about, not just migrations, but other sort of, international SEO, tech SEO, and stuff like that?
So I've really grown keen on LinkedIn these days. I'm on LinkedIn a lot, not on Twitter anymore, not that often. And I will be in some European SEO conferences, Brighton SEO. I will be in Orbit in Slovenia as well this April. Actually, in 2 weeks it is. I will quickly check my agenda to see where else I can be. I will
Yeah, I'm
definitely
just
be in European Search Awards in Prague and more events. So yeah, I'll post where I go. So please approach me if you've heard this episode and you liked it or not, you disagree. Please join the conversation because it's always interesting to hear what everyone thinks. It's so
yeah.
dependent on everyone's unique experience, isn't it? One
No,
migration
100
can mark you for life.
No, 100%. And I'm just sort of cautious of when this goes live, which might be May time. So it's like if somebody's trying to hit this in advance, it's like, well, I don't know. Ask Natalia on LinkedIn. She'll be somewhere, speaking somewhere at a meetup. I've personally I've met Natalia a few times now, and always a great person to be around. So on that, thank you so much, Natalia, for your time and for sharing your wisdom here today on the SEO Unplugged podcast. Thank you to everyone watching and listening to this episode, and we will see you in the next one.
Hey, you've reached the end of this video, but don't worry, there's plenty more great content that you can watch right now. All you have to do is click one of the 2 video links on the left side of the screen. And also, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to never miss out on future uploads.